Okay, so I recognise some familiar faces in the room, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark Eggleton. I'm a principal consultant with Excitech. I've been with Excitech about 3.5 years now. It's flown by. It's been loads of fun so far. It's good. But previously, I was the what was called the BIM integration manager at the Atomic Weapons Establishment. So I spent about 5 years working at AWE, based just outside Reading. Working with the estates management team, the facilities management team, and asset management team, looking into the capital delivery of projects and the specification of BIM delivery, how we're going to get the data we need throughout the project, how we're then going to integrate it into the operational systems and be able to exploit it to work towards an optimized estate. So I spent 5 years doing that, which I'm sure, as you can imagine, was very, very challenging. It was a large estate. It comprised of about 1,500 facilities. It ranged from bicycle sheds to plutonium manufacturing facilities. So real variance in what was there. Lots of ageing facilities, so we got lots of refurbishment works going on and a major capital new build program to replace a lot of those existing facilities. And the challenge was really to be able to work with the supply chain of the big contractors, the lead designers, and BIM was really in its infancy at that stage around how do we work in a much smarter, better way to provide data which can be used not just during the project but subsequently in operations and start to really optimize the estate that we were looking to manage. So that experience led me to do some consulting with Excitech, and since being with Excitech, I've worked with a number of large estate owners and operators, ranging from universities, airports, involved in a lot of the sort of major infrastructure projects that are happening at the moment across the UK. Supporting a lot of companies with their BIM adoption. So organisationally, strategically, what does BIM mean to them? How are they implementing it into their organisation? What do they need to think of and consider as they engage with supply chain on projects? And that also then starts to lead into discussions around data management strategies, common data environments, how we're managing and accessing this information and making it available to others. So I'm going to start with just some insights from myself based on some of the conversations I've been having. When I go in and see estate owners, operators, facility management teams, we often find that actually getting an accurate and up-to-date image of what's happening out there on the facility at the moment is very difficult. We find that there's lots of conflicting information, lots of multiple versions, lots of contradictory information, and actually trying to find the right information to support the decision-making process is very difficult. We accept that there's lots of good knowledge, lots of experience in people's heads. These people are soon to retire. Where's it going? How are we going to learn from that? How are we going to take that information out and make it explicit and available? And it's difficult to maintain the information, keep it up to date with all the changes that are happening around our facilities. And because of all of that, it's impossible to actually have a good understanding of where we are, but also be able to look ahead and make smart strategic decisions based on our assets. So you'll be familiar with the term lean manufacturing, lean construction and BIM is a conversation that's happening a lot at the moment in industry. Lean operations, okay? It's about the removal of wasteful processes that we currently accept happens because of all of these challenges around managing the information. So this is just some of the conversations that I have time and time again when I go in and see clients and things that we have to try and get beyond. So you should be familiar with this life cycle when we're talking about an asset or a built facility. Okay, 4 different stages. We've got the acquisition stage where we're going out and we're buying a capability, whether that's a new build capability or a significant refurbishment or repurposing of an existing facility. That's really where the design and the contractors get engaged with each other through that acquisition process. We then come over into the operational, so we're ramping up to make this facility operational, and then going into the maintenance life cycle, where eventually that continues to happen until we get to a point where we make a decision to either dispose it because it's no longer required, upgrade it, renew it, repurpose it, and that takes us back into the acquisition life cycle. Now again, based on the conversations I've been having and been engaged with, it seems that there's some real trust barriers between all of these different stages. So I call them trust barriers. They've probably got lots of different other names, but it's basically talking about when a facility or an asset transitions from one steady state into another. There's lots of activity that happens, and you're working with multiple parties, lots of teams, these trust barriers are up, which leads to a lot of abortive work, a lot of rework, a lot of nuclear effort being employed. And actually within each of these stages, there are what we call mini trust barriers happening. So if we look at even between the design team, a multidiscipline design team, the architect's working with the M&E contractor or designer, the use of information and the trust in that information that's being provided, all these trust barriers are up, which means there's lots of rework and lots of effort to confirm the information that you're using to actually employ it in a smart way. So we acknowledge and we accept that these trust barriers are there in between these life cycle stages as information is passed from one to another and between multiple team members. And we accept that there's these mini trust barriers in the way, even within these life cycle stages. But what I am seeing, thankfully, and it's been coming for a long time, is actually in the acquisition phase now, thanks to the use of BIM and this collaborative way of working and this sharing of data and exchanging of information, we are seeing a lot of these trust barriers being broken down in that acquisition phase. We are seeing contractors working better with design teams. We are seeing contractors now engaging with the design teams to say, can you provide us the information in this way so that it can help us with our pre-construction activities and support us in the job that we need to do downstream of the design. So all that is happening, thankfully. But there's still a major trust barrier, and I'm sure all of you are experiencing this. When a project is complete and it's handed over, and that movement of information into operations, there is a lot of effort still going on to collate the information, understand the information, have trust in the information to support the planning around the operational phase of the facility. So we've got to start looking at this now and BIM, and this is happening in little pockets out there in industry, but we need to get it more mainstream around the operational phases, the O&M phases, getting more involved in the acquisition phase to start inputting into that design, into that creation of that information and data to make sure that it is effective in its downstream use, and we can start to break down a lot of those trust barriers. So this is a question that I often get asked when I go into estates or go and see estates teams. To BIM or not to BIM? When is it appropriate? When do we have to instruct this? How is this happening? We've got loads of CAD information, or we've got lots of documents and data that we currently manage. What does this mean? We're not sure. Arms up in the air. Confusion. So this is quite often the conversation we have. So new build construction, very little of it going on. It's often big projects that happen not very frequently, but absolutely BIM is going to be used on there. It used to be a question around to BIM or not to BIM on new builds when we were very much still talking about level 1, CAD and all the rest of it. But pretty much any time you're going to engage with the supply chain now or a main contractor, they're going to come back to you and start talking to you about BIM. Significant refurbishment. Again, where there's multi-disciplines involved, if it's quite complex, if it's of a sizable scale, you're going out to the supply chain, it's going to be a BIM project. Okay? They're going to be using BIM software to create the information and the data, and there is real opportunity there to input and feed into that and get what you want out of it. When we start talking a lot of the smaller types of works, this is probably the vast majority of the types of work you're doing. The question then really comes into the quality of your baseline information. So what are you managing at the moment? Is it accessible? Is it reliable? Has it been maintained over the life of that facility? If you've got an up-to-date, accurate CAD plan of your building and you're only doing a small alteration or a small addition, use the information you've got. However, if it's poor and you can't access it, or it's folded up in someone's drawer across the other side of your estate, you then have to think about going out and using the modern methods that are available to you to use to capture that information and bring it back into this environment. So dependent on scale and complexity of the change, the quality of your information will force you down a decision when you start to get engaged in projects. But significant refurbishments or repurposing or new build construction, if you're engaging with the supply chain, they're going to be coming back to you with this question around BIM. So if you're not specifying it, expect to be challenged on it and be able to have a sensible conversation on it. So when we talk about the use of BIM for FM, I'm really focusing on the discipline of information management. Okay? So during the operational and maintenance stage of a facility, you're going to have to make decisions. You need information available to make those decisions. You need to have trust in that information to be able to make the better decisions. So the decisions typically fall into monitoring what's going on in the facility, determining what the facility needs, and managing those facility resources. So to support that effective decision making, the required information must be available, reliable, accurate, and complete. Otherwise, you're guessing, you're making assumptions, and assumptions equals risk. Okay? So we need to be able to have the best information available we can have. And the use of BIM on a project, actually, as we've seen in the acquisition phase, through the design and construction teams being able to collaborate more effectively, is enabling them to make better decisions throughout the design and build. It presents the same opportunity to you guys, FM teams, to get involved in that, to start to, not dictate, that's the wrong word, engage in the conversation to be able to get as much out of it as you can. And we talk about this mantra of the right information at the right time to the right person to support the right decision. And that's all we're talking around with BIM. It's about working together more collaboratively, the FM teams and the operational guys getting more involved in the project process to determine the outcomes and get the data they need. So the opportunity is there for the operational teams to get in. Okay? Get involved in those project discussions, start putting together your requirements around what you think you need, how you're going to manage it. And this includes communicating how you're going to use that data that comes over from the project afterwards. Now, it might be that you're anticipating how the building is going to operate in terms of costings, energy performance, etc. You know, if you can feed into that and communicate that that's part of your objectives, you can work with the design teams and the construction teams to get the data out in a more effective way to support that decision making. Whether space planning, utilization, occupancy if you're a university, or some other type of facility that focuses on that area. Again, it's about feeding in to what you need in order so you can get out of it what you want. And plant and equipment, planned versus reactive. Too much reactive maintenance going on. Too much. PPM, we need to be working towards knowing what assets we are managing, when maintenance is required, what spares we're going to need, and all of those good things. And our target is to get to a more sustainable version of facilities management. Not just based on, obviously, the energy performance side, but the cost of running the facility and trying to optimize our estate. So when we look at benefits, well, there's a benefit or an opportunity to be able to reduce the cost of information capture. I was working with a very large client recently, talking about a project that happened some time ago, and it actually took them 2 years to gather and collect the information that was provided by the project and make sense of it and start to use it in operations. So it's quite a significant investment from themselves to put a team together, to take all that information and start making sense of it and starting to use it to actually manage the facility. So the projects are going to be creating information as part of their design and build anyway. So how can we get involved? How can we start to specify what we want and get the information that we require? Through that process, we're looking at reducing the amount of rework at handover, and we're improving the trust of the information because we've been involved. And actually, instead of managing lots of drawing files and documents and all the rest of it, we're starting to integrate the data into our systems, into our operational systems. So it's almost like a direct migration. And then, because we've been involved in that process, we have more trust in that information. We have through that and the analysation of that data, we're able to look forward, plan ahead, exploit the data, and start to look and see how we can optimise the facility. And that leads us to looking to plan out the life cycle of the building, start looking at sustainability planning. And, when we're talking about keeping data up to date, not drawings, not documents, we might do that in conjunction, but we're really focusing on the data. It gives us more ability to manage those small changes that are happening in our facility and helps provide the basis for better decision making in the future. So it all sounds good, right? Good opportunity there, lots of benefits. There are some challenges. So I don't know how many of you have been involved with project teams to date. Once the project gets going, it's quite challenging to influence it sometimes. Often there'll be, oh yeah, you want that? Yeah, okay, here's the bill. Okay, so if we're not clear and upfront at that briefing bit right at the beginning, where we're specifying our requirements clearly, anything after that is often going to lead to additional costs. Another example of a project I was working on recently where, unfortunately, the requirements were put together too late, went back to the contractor. Yeah, we can do all that, but here's a big... And what we're actually seeing is a lot of contractors are putting together almost like a standard approach for working on a BIM project, where they're almost dictating what they're going to give to you as part of their standard offering and their price. And believe me, it is the minimum, okay, because it's the minimum of what they want to do. So your opportunity then to go back and say, well, actually, this information would be really useful to this, because this is how we want to manage our facility. It will lead to a conversation around costs. But part of that is that clear specification. So I say clear specification, it's not just we need BIM on this project. You need to think ahead, think about the information you need, communicate why, put it into a clear specification that you can have a sensible conversation around. Quite often, again, going back to insights, we see COBie as a requirement. It's not really thought about, it's not considered enough, and it's not explained enough in the requirements document. The contractor will always push back on it, and they will give you a much watered down version than what you actually need. So there's lots of challenges around this space, around being able to communicate clearly at the right time into the project to be able to make a change. So validation of the data is an interesting one as well. Lots of conversations going on around this in this area. So you're going to specify the data you need. How are you going to check it? It's very complicated. You know, you're going to have to learn additional skills. There's new challenges around that. There's lots of technology that's emerging that's going to help you, but you still have to be cognizant of what you're actually checking it for and how you're going to check it, how you're going to measure the compliance and report on any non-conformances. Integration of the data into FM systems. So again, another area where the gap is being bridged. There's lots of testing that needs to happen around that. You're going to be receiving lots of data in structured formats from projects. You need to be testing it in your systems. You need to be able to feed back into the project and say, this didn't quite work, the export out of the software wasn't quite right. Okay? And the ongoing maintenance. Model maintenance. It's an interesting one for estate owners. Do they now have to go and buy 50 licenses of Revit to maintain the model from across their estate? Maybe, maybe not. But it's a decision. If you need to keep this information up to date, if it's business critical, if it's got some sort of regulation behind it, some sort of license condition, we really need to think about how we're going to manage and maintain this information throughout the operational life cycle and maintain that accurate baseline to, again, break down some of those trust barriers when we go back out and ask someone to do something for us using that information. So when we talk about engaging with the projects, if you've been fortunate enough to been engaged on a project that's using BIM to date, you'll be familiar with this terminology. EIR and AIR, everyone know what that is? No? So EIR is an employer's information requirements, and an AIR is an asset information requirements. It's key BIM terminology. It's in all of the PAS 1192 standards. And the EIR is the vehicle of communicating on a project to the project team your requirements around the information in terms of what you need to be delivered on that project and how it needs to be structured, organised, and issued across. So all it is really, in summary, is a conversation between the employer and the project team to say, this is the information I need to support the tasks that I need to do post-project during the operational life of the facility. This is the data I need against these particular types of assets. And this is how I need it prepared and structured in such a way that I can integrate it into my systems and exploit it. And in response, the project teams come back with, here's everything you asked for. This is going to help you plan your activities and your tasks during the operational life cycle. Here is the data that you've asked for against the assets that you specified. And I've structured it in accordance with your requirements so you can integrate it into your systems. And that's a very simplistic view of actually what happens or what should be happening. But taking a step back, that conversation between the operational team of the facility and the project delivery team needs to be happening, and it needs to be clearly communicating what is required. So putting the EIR at the centre, because it's the employer's information requirements that's issued out as part of the invitation to tender. As part of the briefing, it's constructed with the employer to set out what information they need throughout delivery of that project and how it should be presented, constructed, how people are going to work together, and all the rest of that good stuff. It is a contractual requirement. Okay? So BIM protocol that should be issued and appended to contracts will reference the EIR. It is a contractual document that goes to the teams. It's what they set out to work against, and it's the top level BIM specification document on a project. Project teams respond to that employer's information requirements with what's known as a BIM execution plan. Okay, so that's them basically saying, we understand your requirements, this is how we plan to deliver it, this is how we're going to deliver it, this is how we're going to break the facility down into a volume strategy, etc. And that is what is judged when we go through the tender process in response to the EIR. Okay, and that basically sets out how the project is going to work from an information management perspective. So we see lots of this happening now. Okay, there was a period, probably about a year or so ago, where the EIR piece wasn't really happening, or it was happening very late on a project, and too late, cat's out of the bag, it's gone. But what we see now is a lot of contractors have been setting up their BIM execution plans in a standardised way, so that in case there isn't an EIR in place, they've at least got some sort of way of planning out how they're going to deliver and execute BIM on that project. But we are seeing lots of this happening now. Pretty much any project you go onto where there's a BIM specification, there will be an EIR in place and a BIM execution plan in place. What's missing, though, is that. So we see it in pockets. We see it every now and then. We're always saying that it's probably the most important document from an operations perspective, but that needs to be included, either appended to, set aside, the employer's information requirements. Now, the asset information requirements is the operations guy saying, these are the assets we're going to manage and maintain. This is what we plan to do. This is the information we need. This is how we need it structured. It's you setting out and communicating clearly what you need at the end of the project so that you can actually do your planning and execution around. So that is where we are, and that is what we need to do more of. And again, this is an area that's being heavily focused on in the industry at the moment around how can we do that in the most effective way possible? How can we start to bring automation into that based on the systems that are going to be within the facility? So when I've worked with clients on developing an AIR, it's all too easy when you go into some of the estate owners or operators or FM clients for them to just go, well, we need everything. Okay, that's not realistic. You can't just have everything. You know, your contractor's going to go, absolutely not. So the advice we gave is we work backwards. We put in a tiered system where we tier the assets or the elements of the facility that we're going to manage in terms of level of importance. And we say we work back from the absolute needs. So if there's a regulation, if it's legal, if there's some sort of statutory element that you have to manage, absolutely, that needs to be communicated. Business critical information, stuff that's going to stop your organisation doing what it does. Okay, we need to make sure that we're capturing that and specifying that information and how that's going to be delivered. And then we start getting into the kind of the nice to have, so desired information. You know, if you strategically you set out this is how you want to manage your operations going forward, this is the desired information that we want. And we work backwards all the way until we get to the information that, yes, you want to collect it, but you're not going to manage and maintain it. So it just becomes for information only. And that tends to be the more sort of building fabric type information. So the more sort of architectural, structural information that isn't really going to change over the course of the life cycle of the facility. Some people refer to it as bricks and sticks. I don't like that personally. But, you know, the actual chances of the structure changing without a major change to the facility that would go back out to supply chain is very low. We're really focusing mainly on the M&E type assets that require lots of maintenance throughout the life cycle of the facility. And then we start to focus as part of our AIR specification, actually, well, what areas of FM are important to us? What are we going to manage? What are we going to use this information for? Is it a highly serviced facility? Do we need to think about asset management and maintenance, plan preventative maintenance? Are we really focusing on space and occupancy levels? Okay, workplace management, where are people working? How's that look? So we need to think as part of our specification and communicate again, how are we going to use this data downstream? And how do you need the data prepared and presented? So, the design teams are going to prepare it in a certain way, contractors are going to work the information and use it to suit their needs. From an operational point of view, how do we tie into that and make use of that and exploit that? How do we communicate things like naming, classification, codification of rooms, of areas, of plant and equipment? What formats are we going to manage? How do we need the models segregated and split up to enable us to be able to manage them and identify and categorize the data in such a way? So all of this needs to feed into your AIR specification. So my advice is, you need to think strategically around where you're going to be. You've got a new build program coming online, 2-3 years. What are we going to be doing? How are we going to manage this? You need to start getting ahead of the game and thinking strategically and mapping out what you need. Take time to think and plan ahead. We're going to be taking this data. How are we going to manage it? Make sure you focus on only what adds value. All too often, we see lots of data specified and asked for. It gets delivered. It gets put on a CD and put in someone's drawer. Nothing happens to it. So what's the point? Unless it's adding value to your organisation, why are you asking for it? And that brings us back to that kind of lean approach again. Say why you need it. Communicate that out as part of your specification. Because your contractor, believe it or not, might be working with someone else and they're doing something similar and they might be doing it in a way that is better than the way that you think you're going to do it. So we need to think about that collaboratively. And if you communicate that to them and they come back with a better solution, why not have that conversation? Say how you need it presented. Make sure it's clear. Try and avoid ambiguity at all costs, because ambiguity will cost, especially when you've got a contractor involved who's focused on delivery of the asset. Okay, it needs to be very clear. We need to not leave any assumptions out there. We need to make it measurable. Now, this is something that I'm quite keen on, is actually how are we testing this with our supply chain? So we're specifying data to come across in such a way. Are we putting any compliance and governance around it? No. Should we be? Absolutely, because how are we holding them to account? The information is a strategic asset. It supports you in the decisions that you need to make. So we need to be able to make sure that we can wrap some compliance and governance around it with our supply chain and make sure they're delivering what they set out to achieve. But we've got to be realistic and we've got to make it achievable as well. So pre-handover validation is an interesting one. So you'll be used to getting reams and reams of drawings and O&M manuals and all sort of bits of information at the end of the project. We're now talking about data. You're going to be getting data. So what are we going to be checking it for? Because we need to check it, because we need to make sure that it comes into our operational systems and it works and that we can exploit it and we can use it to make our operational decisions. So what are we checking it for? Are we checking that it's geospatially accurate and correct? If the correct model merging and volume strategy is being applied and the spatial structure is there around the data? We're looking for consistent naming around levels and floors, types, what are we calling things, what are we calling components, spaces, are they all correct? Equipment naming and identifiers, okay, we're going to be using this information downstream, it needs to fit into some sort of system that we're going to manage. Locations, finishes, the list goes on. Essentially, that's up to you guys to determine based on how you are going to manage the facility and the information you need. But we need to think about how we check this information and what skill sets and technologies we can use to support that. So it's a good example. Is all the data in the Revit file? Is that what's been specified as part of the project? If so, what do we need at the end of the project? How are we going to check all of that data's in there? Are we asking for IFC to be delivered at the end of the project? How do we know that it's been exported in the right way, has the right information? What can we build around that to check that data and feed back any areas of non-compliance or non-conformance? There's tools like Celibri and Navisworks where we can bring the federated models together. We can start to look at the geometry side of things, but we can also start now to look at the data and the data quality that's in there, checking if all of the Kobe fields, for example, have been inputted against and if they're correct. And you may receive just an Excel spreadsheet. Many of the employer's information requirements we see at the moment are specifying a Kobe output from the project in an Excel spreadsheet. Has anyone ever seen one of these things? Horrendous, isn't they? Yeah, can you imagine going through that? Line by line, checking. Yeah. So the good news is that there are technologies developing, being built around, making that job easier, and automation and all the rest of that good stuff. But it's just something you need to consider as part of your specification. Be thinking ahead, be thinking, how are we going to validate, check, and make sure the information and the data provided is what we need and want. So what does compliance, data compliance look like? So interestingly, and I'd be interested to maybe afterwards see how this goes down, but we're working with a client at the moment that's asking their supply chain to self-certify the data that they're providing at the end of the project. Now they must have a pretty big carrot on the end of their stick to dangle that towards the supply chain to ask them to self-certify their information. I'd be interested to see how that goes, to be honest. So what they're expecting as an employer is that as information is provided to them by the project team, it will come with a nice certificate that says that they've checked it, it meets all of the requirements and is ready for use. Yeah. Nice idea, but really we need to move beyond that. We need to be working together with clear specification and being able to dip in and check and validate and go as we go. We know this with partial sign-off, sample checks of data rather than large volumes, reporting on any areas of non-conformance. Obviously, depending on the areas of non-conformance or the amount of non-conformances that are found will lead to further compliance checks. And, we start to think, well, when should all of this checking be happening? I would suggest that pre-handover or at the point of handover is too late. Okay. We need to be involved in the project. We need to be engaging with these teams. We need to be doing these data compliance checks as we go. And we need to be able to feed back in any areas or issues that we find. So, a little bit ahead. But final thoughts, really, around technology. How can technology support all of these issues around specification, getting involved in determining the brief, including specification of the asset information requirements that are relative to the building or the facility that you're going to manage. What technologies are developing around automation of validation and checking. Okay, I would say that this is a rapidly developing area. Lots of technology firms are looking at this. There are many ways to achieve the desired outcome. Okay, so obviously as part of this, as our role as trusted advisor, we keep an eye on this. We advise on what's out there in the market and how it can work. But there are more and more technological, rule-based solutions that are being developed and starting to be used. But you need to determine which is the best for you, which is the best fit. Okay? Which fits your model of how you want to integrate this with other systems and use it organisationally and tie it into the enterprise-wide systems if that's an aspiration. What skills are required? Well, if you're going to be engaged in BIM projects and you're going to be challenged by contractors, you need to be able to have that sensible conversation. So you do need an understanding of some of the fundamentals of BIM when you're prescribing BIM use on a project, so that you can get around the table, you can address some of those challenges that are coming from your contractor and have that sensible discussion around specification and clearly communicate what you mean and need. You do need to understand the BIM specifications, so the stuff around PAS 1192, all of the different areas, including Part 3, obviously, because that's based on the operational side, and Part 5 around the security-minded approach. And we do need to start getting our heads around data validation and use of terminology like IFC and COBie, understanding what that means and determining how we need it provided and how we're going to validate that. And then lastly, it's around that piece of integrating it into FM systems. That testing, that continual testing of information and feeding back into the project to make sure that it suits and meets the requirements.